The world had shrunk to a single, frozen breath. Outside the rattling windshield of the snowcat, the Alaskan night was an absolute void, a suffocating blanket of black and white that stretched into an eternity Jack could feel in his bones. The twin beams of his headlights carved a narrow tunnel through the swirling snow, illuminating the only constant in this dilation, the massive, elevated spine of the Trans-Alaska Pipeline, a dark serpent of steel winding its way through the endless white. It was 1985, and the deep winter had clamped down with a vengeance, turning the sun into a distant, forgotten memory for weeks on end. Inside the cab, the heater fought a losing battle against the cold that seeped through every seam. Jack's gloved hands were stiff on the wheel, his movements slow and practiced. He was a security patrolman, a sentinel for a vein of oil that pulsed through the heart of the frozen wilderness. The job was a study in solitude, a self-imposed exile that paid just enough to keep the creditors from his ex-wife's door, but never enough to mend the things that were truly broken. His gaze drifted from the hypnotic sway of the wipers to the small, faded photograph wedged into the dashboard's cracked vinyl. It was his daughter, Sarah, beaming with a gap-toothed smile on her 7th birthday, a birthday he had missed 2 days ago. His call to her, staticky, rushed apology from a phone booth in the middle of nowhere. The memory was a sharper, more personal cold than anything the Alaskan winter could conjure. He slowed the snowcat to a crawl, the engine groaning in protest. A small, numbered marker post, barely visible through the ice-caked window, indicated a sensor cluster. Routine. He pulled on his heavy fur-lined hood, the movement stirring the stale air, and pushed the door open. The cold hit him like a physical blow, stealing his breath and frosting his eyelashes in an instant. The silence was the first thing he noticed. A profound and heavy quiet so complete it felt like a presence. It was broken only by the crunch of his own boots on the permafrost, a sound that seemed obscenely loud, a violation. Each step echoed, and in that echo, his mind, starved for stimulus, began to paint threats. Was that just the settling of a snowdrift, or something moving, pacing him just beyond the reach of his light? He reached the sensor box, its metal casing frosted over. He scraped the ice away with his glove, his breath pluming in the frigid air. The indicator lights glowed a steady, reassuring green, all nominal. No pressure drops, no temperature spikes. Just the pipeline, doing what it always did, indifferent to the man who guarded it. He tapped the gauge twice, a superstitious habit, and turned back toward the warm yellow glow of the snowcat's cab. But he paused, his shoulders tense. He scanned the darkness, his senses straining. There was nothing out there. Nothing but the pipeline, the snow, and the crushing weight of his own isolation. Was a dread that began not as a fear of something specific, but as a deep cellular understanding that in this much emptiness, anything could be hiding, and no one would ever hear you scream. The shrill, electronic shriek of the alarm tore through the snowcat's insulated cab, a sound so alien and urgent it severed Jack's weary trance. Instantly, his heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic drumbeat against the oppressive silence. On the dashboard, a single red light blinked with frantic insistence, casting a bloody glow across his face. The digital display below it spelled out the problem in stark green letters. Temp anomaly. Sector 7. Sector 7. Remote. A stretch of the pipeline that snaked through a shallow, wind-scoured valley. A place the maintenance crews grumbled about. And the maps labeled with a warning about unpredictable ground ice. Jack's first, weary thought was of a faulty sensor. A ghost in the machine, after weeks of brutal cold. He'd seen it before, but this felt different. The alert's persistence, the specific, localized nature of the reading. It wasn't a general system failure. It was a pinpoint, a distress signal from the ice itself. His hand, clumsy amidst thick glove, closed around the cold plastic of the radio handset. He keyed the mic, the static hiss. A familiar comfort. "Mike, you copy? Base, this is Patrol 1. You seeing this?" The silence on the other end stretched for a beat too long before Mike's voice crackled through, tinny and distant. "Reading you, Jack. Yeah, we see it. Sector 7's throwing a fit. Control says it's probably a sensor glitch. Damn things freeze solid out there." There was a pause, filled only by the white noise between them. "You want me to roll out and meet you?" Jack considered it. "The company of another human being, the shared burden of the drive. But the protocol was clear, and the thought of waiting felt worse than going alone." "Negative," he said, forcing a lightness into his voice. He didn't feel. "I'm closer. I'll go. Take a look." Probably just the pipeline ghosts getting restless again. It was their old dark joke, a term they used for the inexplicable noises and sensor blips that plagued the most isolated sections. Tonight, the words tasted like ash in his mouth. Mike's chuckle was thin, strained. "Right. The ghosts. Well, watch your back, partner. Radio, if you find anything. Or anyone." The line went dead, leaving Jack alone with the blinking red light and the growing void outside. He swung the snowcat around, its tracks grinding through the deep snow, and pointed its nose toward the valley. As he drove, the world outside began to change. The overcast sky, a uniform sheet of oppressive gray, began to tear open, first in small rents, then in great, shimmering curtains. The northern lights erupted. They were not the gentle green waves he was used to. These were violent, lashing tongues of emerald and violet, a celestial frenzy that painted the snow in unnatural shifting hues. They writhed and pulsed, a silent, screaming aurora that felt less like a spectacle and more like a warning. And as the lights danced, the cold deepened. It was no longer the simple, biting cold of the Arctic winter. This was something else, something that seeped through the snowcat's steel hull and the layers of his thermal gear, as if they were tissue paper. It was a cold that felt sentient, a physical presence that pressed in from all sides. It carried a strange metallic scent on the wind, like ozone and old ice. He found himself holding his breath, listening not for sounds, but for the absence of them. The usual groan of the snowcat's engine, the whine of the tracks they were being swallowed, muffled by this new, living cold. A primal unease, cold and slick, coiled in his gut. This was no sensor glitch. This was a fluctuation of something far older and far more dangerous than the pipeline. and he was driving straight into its heart. The snowcat's headlights finally died against the impossible geometry of the fracture. Jack had braked so hard the vehicle had slewed sideways, its tracks churning up a plume of ice crystals that settled like a shroud. He sat for a long moment, the engines idle, a dull, distant throb, his mind refusing to process the vista of ruin before him. The pipeline at Sector 7 was not just compromised, it was besieged. A jagged black chasm, wide enough to swallow his snowcat whole, encircled the massive support pylons in a brutal fractured embrace. It was not a clean split, but a violent rupture, as if the very permafrost had been wrenched apart by colossal, unseen hands. He killed the engine, and the sudden silence was a physical weight. The frenzied aurora had vanished, leaving the sky flat, dead black, and the unnatural cold he had felt on the drive now felt concentrated here, a deep freeze that made the air ache. Stepping out of the cab was like stepping into another world. His boots crunched on ice that was not the usual packed snow, but a glossy, brittle surface that seemed to ring with a faint, crystalline tone under his weight. He approached the edge of the fissure with a caution that felt ancestral, a primal fear of the abyss slowing his steps. The chasm descended into a profound darkness that his eyes could not penetrate. It was a blackness that seemed to swallow light, to swallow sound, to swallow hope. He unclipped the heavy-duty flashlight from his belt, his fingers fumbling with the switch. The beam, a solid white lance he usually trusted to cut through the worst blizzards, seemed pathetically weak. Against that depth, he aimed it downward, and the light skimmed over walls of ancient compressed ice. They were not smooth. As he moved the beam slowly along the rim, the light caught on something that made his breath hitch. Etched into the very fabric of the ice were patterns. They were geometric, precise, and utterly alien. Sharp, interlocking angles spiraled into fractals that hurt to look at for too long. Lines converged and split in ways that defied logic, forming shapes that were neither circles nor squares, but something in between, something that spoke of a mathematics not born on Earth. They were not scratched onto the surface. They were within the ice, as if the frozen water had crystallized around these impossible blueprints eons ago. The patterns pulsed with a faint internal phosphorescence, a sickly greenish blue that seemed to throb in time with his own quickening heartbeat. He leaned further over the edge, the cold radiating from the chasm, numbing his face. He was so focused on the hypnotic, buried glyphs that he almost missed the vibration at first. It started as a faint tremor in the soles of his boots, a subtle hum that traveled up through his bones. Then it grew, deepening into a low, resonant frequency that seemed to emanate from the very core of the planet. It was not a sound heard so much as felt, a subsonic thrum that vibrated in his teeth, filled his skull, and set the fillings in his mouth aching. The hairs on the back of his neck, already stiff with the cold, rose in a unified wave of pure animal alarm. This was no geological shift, no icequake. This was a heartbeat. A deep, slow, waking heartbeat from the dark below, and he was standing directly over its source, driven by a morbid fascination that overrode the screaming instinct to flee. Jack leaned further over the jagged lip of the crevasse. The geometric patterns, now clearly visible in the ice walls, seemed to writhe in the periphery of his vision, their sickly luminescence casting long, dancing shadows into the abyss. He shifted the flashlight beam, probing deeper past the etched symbols into the absolute blackness at the heart of the fracture. The low, resonant hum vibrated up through the soles of his boots, a constant, unsettling thrum that felt like the prelude to a seismic event. At first, he mistook them for tricks of the light pale, indistinct smudges suspended in the glacial blue. But as his eyes adjusted, the smudges resolved into shapes. Long, slender, and bone-white. They coiled and uncoiled with a languid, fluid grace. They were limbs, or something that mimicked the idea of limbs. But their structure was all wrong. They possessed too many joints, bending in places that defied anatomy, moving in a silent, synchronized ballet deep within their frozen prison. The sight was so fundamentally unnatural that his brain struggled to categorize it, leaving him with only a cold, rising nausea. He leaned closer still, the frost from his own ragged breaths dusting the ice near his face. One of the pale shapes, longer and more complex than the others, drifted slowly toward his beam of light. It turned with a deliberate arachnid grace, and a face emerged from the gloom. It was a pale, elongated oval, devoid of any nose or mouth, its surface smooth and unblemished, like polished alabaster. But where eyes should have been, there were only two pools of absolute blackness, voids so deep and lightless they seemed to be wounds in reality itself. Those empty eyes locked onto his. A primal terror, older than reason, older than language, erupted within Jack. It was a fear of the deep of the buried thing that should never see the sun, of the predator that had been waiting in the dark for millennia. A strangled gasp tore from his throat, and he stumbled back, his boots slipping on the glassy ice. His grip on the flashlight failed. The heavy metal cylinder tumbled from his numb fingers, its beam cartwheeling through the darkness in a frantic final arc before it was swallowed by the depths. The light vanished without a sound, extinguished as if it had never existed. He fell hard onto his back, the impact jarring his teeth, but he felt no pain, only the all-consuming ice of that terror. He scrambled backward, crab-like, his gaze fixed on the crevasse, half expecting one of those pale, multi-jointed limbs to come slithering over the rim. The darkness was now absolute, the humming from below seeming to grow louder, more insistent, as if his discovery had been noted, his presence registered. He was alone in the endless night, unarmed, unseeing, with the certain, soul-shattering knowledge that he was not alone. Something was in the ice, and it was awake. The primal scream trapped in Jack's throat dissolved into ragged, panting breaths that plumed in the air like ghosts. He scrambled back from the chasm's edge on hands and knees, the rough ice tearing at his gloves, his entire being screaming with the need for distance from the thing in the dark. The image of that pale, eyeless face was seared onto his retinas, a negative after-image that floated before him even when he squeezed his eyes shut. He had to tell someone. The thought was a frantic, desperate mantra cutting through the static of his fear. He fumbled at his hip, his fingers clumsy and shaking. Unsnapping the leather holster that held his radio, device felt impossibly small and fragile in his hand. A tinny lifeline to a world that suddenly felt galaxies away. He thumbed the power switch, and the small green light glowed to life. A flicker of hope. He raised it to his lips, his voice a raw, broken thing as he keyed the transmit button. "Baze, this is Patrol 1. Do you copy?" "Emergency. I have an emergency at Sector 7. The response was not a voice, but a wall of sound. A harsh, grating blast of pure white noise that erupted from the speaker. It was a sound with no source and no meaning, a screeching, metallic static that shredded the silence and grated against his nerves. He flinched, pulling the radio away from his ear. "Base, come in." "Mike! Hey! Anyone! Can you hear me?" He yelled into the handset, his words swallowed by the relentless, screeching hiss. He twisted the squelch knob, but it did nothing. The static was absolute, unyielding. A cold that had nothing to do with the Arctic air seeped into his bones. He tried Mike's private frequency, the one they used for their dark jokes and shared complaints. "Mike, it's Jack. Answer me, goddammit." The same brutal, meaningless noise. He cycled through every preset channel. The maintenance band, the emergency distress frequency, even the civilian weather station. On every single one, the story was the same. A screaming, electronic void. No voices, no beacons, no faint crackle of a distant civilization. Just static. He stared at the little device in his hand, its green power light a mocking, steady eye. This wasn't a technical failure. A broken radio would be silent or sputter with weak, dying signals. This was different. This static felt intentional, aggressive. It was a blanket, a shroud thrown over this entire sector, smothering every wavelength, severing every thread that connected him to the world of men. He was in a bubble of perfect isolation, and the static was its shimmering, impenetrable wall. The panic that had been a simmering dread now boiled over, icy and sharp. He was cut off, utterly and completely alone with something that had been sleeping in the ice for centuries, something that had looked at him with voids for eyes, and which had now, very deliberately, cut the phone lines. The static was a cage of sound, and Jack had to break free. The memory of those black, empty eyes staring from the ice was a brand on his mind, but the thought of Mike, alone and unaware out here in the same suffocating silence, was a sharper, more urgent terror. He abandoned his own snowcat, its useless radio still hissing on the seat, and began to run. His boots punched through the crust of snow, his breath sawing in his lungs, each gasp a cloud of pure panic frozen in the air. He followed the pipeline, a dark, guiding serpent against the white expanse, his eyes scanning the emptiness for any sign of his partner's truck. He found it a half-mile down the line, parked at a crooked angle near a support pylon, as if Mike had pulled over in a hurry. The driver's side door hung wide open, a dark mouth agape in the snow. That single detail was more wrong than anything Jack had yet seen. In this cold, no one left a door open, It was a fundamental law of survival, as instinctive as breathing. The interior dome light was a sickly yellow eye staring out into the night, illuminating the vacant driver's seat. Jack slowed his run to a stumbling walk, his heart a frantic drum against his ribs. His eyes tracked from the open door to the ground, and what he saw there stole the last of his warmth. Deep, parallel furrows gouged the snow, starting at the truck's running board and leading away into the darkness. They were not footprints. They were dragging marks, wide and brutal, as if something heavy and unresisting had been hauled across the frozen ground. A few yards out, he saw the clear, crisp impressions of Mike's heavy work boots marching purposefully toward the pipeline. Jack's eyes followed the trail, a fragile thread of humanity in the wilderness, and then his blood ran cold. The footprints did not fade or wander. They simply stopped. It was as if Mike had taken a final step and then been plucked from the earth, yanked upward into the starless, black sky. There were no other tracks, no sign of a struggle, just that abrupt, impossible termination. A low moan escaped Jack's lips, part grief, part sheer, uncomprehending horror. He stumbled back to the truck, his hand gripping the cold metal of the door frame for support. His gaze swept the cab's interior, searching for a clue, a note, anything. And there, on the passenger seat, sat Mike's thermos and, beside it, a half-eaten sandwich on a piece of wax paper, a roast beef on rye, Mike's favorite. Jack reached in, his gloved hand hovering over the food. He didn't want to touch it, but he had to know. He pulled his glove off with his teeth and pressed his bare fingertips against the exposed bread. It was warm. The faint, lingering heat from his partner's last meal seeped into his skin. The tiny, devastating ember of a life interrupted moments ago. The reality of it crashed down on him. Mike had been here, humming along to the radio, eating his lunch, utterly unaware. Then the door had swung open. Then the dragging. Then the vanishing. The warmth of the bread was a cruel mockery, a testament to how quickly a man could be erased from the world, leaving behind nothing but a few scuffs in the snow and the ghost of his body heat on a forgotten sandwich. Jack stood frozen in the open door of the abandoned truck, the static in his ears now a funeral dirge, the endless white around him suddenly feeling infinitely more crowded and infinitely more empty. The silence that rushed in to fill the void, left by the static, was somehow worse. It was a watchful silence, a predatory quiet that pressed in on Jack from all sides, heavy with intent. He stood frozen by Mike's truck, the lingering warmth of the sandwich a brand on his memory, the image of those abruptly ending. Footprints seared into his mind. Then he heard it, a soft, skittering sound, like dry insect legs scraping against ice. It came from his left, near the massive shadow-draped supports of the pipeline. He spun around, his breath catching in his throat, his eyes straining against the gloom. Nothing, just the skeletal geometry of the support struts and the deep, pooling darkness beneath them. He took a hesitant step back toward his own snowcat, the need for its metal shell, its familiar controls, an overwhelming instinct, The skittering came again, this time from his right, closer. A flicker of movement registered in his peripheral vision, a tall, lean shadow detaching itself from the deeper shadow of a pylon and flowing with impossible speed and silence into the next patch of cover. It was not a shape he could define, just an impression of elongated limbs and a swift, unnerving grace. He was not alone. The feeling was a physical certainty, a cold finger tracing its way down his spine. Unseen eyes were on him, studying him, tracking his every twitch and breath. Paranoia, cold and sharp, injected itself directly into his bloodstream. Every creak of the pipeline contracting in the cold, every sigh of the wind over the snow, became the footfall of a pursuer. The darkness between the supports was no longer empty. It was a tapestry of hiding places, each one a potential lair for the thing that had taken Mike. He broke into a run, a frantic, stumbling sprint back toward the yellow beacon of his snowcat. His lungs burned, his legs felt like lead, and the feeling of being watched was a constant, oppressive weight between his shoulder blades. He dared a glance back and saw another shadow flit from one support to another, keeping pace with him effortlessly, a phantom in a dead man's world. He reached the snowcat, his hands fumbling for the door handle, yanking it open and throwing himself inside. He slammed the door shut, the thud of metal on metal, a blessedly solid, human sound. For a single, heart-stuttering moment, he felt a flicker of safety. Then his hand went to the ignition, twisting the key. The engine gave a single, choked, grinding cough, and fell silent. The dashboard lights, which should have glowed to life, remained dark, dead. He tried again, pumping the gas pedal, his desperation mounting. Nothing. Not even a click. His eyes dropped to the dashboard, to the fuel gauge. It was still half full. This wasn't a lack of gas. This was sabotage. A new, deeper terror seized him. He flung the door open again and scrambled out, dropping to his knees in the snow to look beneath the vehicle. In the faint, reflected light from the cab, he saw it. The thick, heavy-duty tires were not just flat, they were shredded. Long, razor-sharp gashes had been torn into the rubber, deep enough to reveal the steel belts within. The cuts were clean, precise, and vicious. They had been methodically disabled, his escape route surgically amputated while he had been staring into the abyss and finding his partner gone. The full, crushing weight of his helplessness descended upon him then, a physical force that drove the air from his lungs. He was stranded, hunted, and utterly at the mercy of something that moved like a shadow and struck with the silence of the grave. He was not just a man in the wilderness anymore. He was prey. The first gust hit like a physical blow, a screaming wall of wind that lifted the top layer of snow and hurled it horizontally, transforming the world into a blinding white chaos. The blizzard did not announce its arrival. It simply was, erupting from the placid darkness with the fury of a waking giant. One moment, Jack was on his knees beside his mutilated snowcat. The reality of his entrapment, a cold stone in his gut. The next, he was blind, deaf, and fighting for balance against a gale that sought to peel him from the earth. The wind's howl was a living thing, a demented chorus that swallowed the skittering sounds and buried the watchful silence under a torrent of pure, elemental violence. Instinct, older than fear, took over. He remembered the small, corrugated steel maintenance shed, a forgotten outpost huddled against a pipeline support pylon 100 yards back the way he'd come. It was a flimsy box, a place for storing spare valves and greasy tools, but in that moment, it was the only promise of sanctuary in a world gone mad. He pushed himself to his feet, leaning into the wind, and began to fight his way toward it. The snow was a stinging, particulate fog that filled his mouth and nose, and the cold was so intense it felt like fire on his exposed skin. Each step was a battle, a lurching, uncertain plunge into the white void, the pipeline his only tactile guide, as he ran a gloved hand along its frozen, vibrating flank. He almost missed it, the shed half buried in a newly formed drift. His numb fingers fumbled with the frozen latch before he managed to wrench the door open, stumbling inside and slamming it shut behind him. The sudden cessation of the wind's scream was jarring, the relative quiet inside the shed a profound relief. It was pitch black, smelling of rust, diesel, and old wood. He fumbled in his parka pocket, his hands shaking uncontrollably, and pulled out a book of matches. The first one sputtered and died. The second flared to life, its tiny, dancing flame revealing the cramped interior. Metal shelves laden with junk, a greasy workbench, and, in the corner, a heavy metal crate used for transporting equipment. The match burned his fingers and he dropped it, plunging the shed back into darkness. But he had seen what he needed. He threw his weight against the metal crate, grunting with the effort, his muscles screaming in protest. It scraped across the concrete floor with an ear-splitting shriek, a sound that felt blasphemously loud. He maneuvered it until it was wedged firmly against the door, a flimsy but tangible barricade between him and the maelstrom outside. Only then did he allow himself to collapse against the wall, sliding down to the cold floor, his entire body racked with shivers that came from a place deeper than mere cold. Huddled in the dark, the wind's howl became a lament, a timeless sound that stripped away the present and dragged up old ghosts. He remembered the stories, tales shared over whiskey in warm bars by grizzled Inuit trappers who knew the ice better than any pipeline patrolman. They spoke of the Iluanik, the ice walkers, not ghosts, but something older, beings of the great cold, ancient consciousnesses that had walked the world when it was young and frozen, and had been trapped slumbering within the heart of the glaciers as the world warmed. They were not malevolent, the old men said, merely alien. Their existence a fundamental law of the frozen places, a truth that modern men had forgotten. They were patient, waiting through the long ages in their crystalline tombs. And the stories always ended with a warning, a lesson passed down from father to son for generations. Do not listen to the ice when it speaks, and never, ever look too long into the deep blue cracks. The wind's howl was a living entity, a demented chorus that screamed of ages spent scouring barren, frozen plains. It clawed at the corrugated steel walls of the maintenance shed with metallic fingernails, each gust shaking the flimsy structure to its foundations. Jack huddled in the corner, his back pressed against the cold metal, his knees drawn to his chest. The heavy crate barricading the door shuddered with every impact, a constant, terrifying reminder of the fury just beyond the thin walls. He had traded the silent, stalking horror of the open ice for the violent, chaotic rage of the storm, and he was not sure which was worse. The shed was a freezing, rust-scented tomb, but it was a tomb with a door he had blocked, a fragile illusion of control in a world that had spun completely off its axis. As the wind screamed its ancient fury, fragments of old stories, told in the warm, smoky haze of an Anchorage bar, surfaced in his memory. An old Inuit trapper, his face a roadmap of wrinkles earned in the deep cold, speaking of the Iliuanic, the Ice Walkers, not monsters, but primordial beings of the endless winter, trapped in glacial slumber when the world changed. They were patient, the old man had said, their consciousness as vast and cold as the ice that held them, and they were waiting. At first, Jack mistook it for a new tenor in the storm's voice, a deeper, guttural resonance woven into the wind's high-pitched shriek. He pressed his hands over his ears, trying to block out the noise, but the sound was not outside. It was inside, seeping through the very walls of the shed, oozing up from the concrete floor. It was a whisper, not a single voice, but a chorus of them, dry and rasping, like stones grinding together at the bottom of a frozen river. The sound coiled through the frigid air, insinuating itself into his mind, bypassing his ears to vibrate directly in the marrow of his bones. It was the antithesis of human speech, a language of cracks and shifts, of immense pressure and patient, glacial time. Driven by a horrified fascination, he pushed himself to his feet, his body stiff with cold and fear. He struck another match, the tiny flame dancing wildly in his trembling hand. He moved it along the shed's interior wall, the light skittering over grimy shells and old oil stains. Then the flame caught on a series of marks etched into the steel paneling near the floor. He crouched down, his breath catching. They were not random scratches from tools or storage. They were symbols, sharp, geometric, and impossibly complex. They spiraled and interconnected in patterns that made his head ache. They were identical to the ones he had seen glowing within the ice of the chasm, a language of angles and lines that defied all known alphabets. Someone, or something, had been here before him, carving this alien scripture into the metal. As his eyes traced the maddening patterns, the whispers grew louder, more distinct. They were no longer just a texture of sound. They were forming words. The syllables were guttural, clicking and cold, a series of phonemes that no human throat could ever reproduce. They echoed in the cramped space, bouncing off the walls and converging on him. He didn't understand the language, but the intent behind the words seeped into his consciousness with chilling clarity. It was not a request. It was a command, an imperative born of an eternity of imprisonment. A single desperate concept repeated over and over, a psychic hammer blow against the walls of his sanity. Free us. Free us. Free us. The plea was not one of gentle longing, but of ancient, undeniable need, a demand from the ice itself, and he was the only soul left to hear it. The whispers had become a physical presence in the shed, a pressure against his eardrums and a cold weight in his chest. Jack huddled lower, pulling his parka tight, as if the synthetic fabric could shield him from the psychic assault. "Free us." The words were no longer just sounds. They were hooks in his mind, pulling at memories, at fears, at the very core of his will. He pressed his forehead against his knees, trying to block it out, to become small and silent and unnoticed. The storm outside seemed to be feeding the phenomenon. The wind's fury, a perfect amplifier for the ancient, buried hunger. He was trapped between the maelstrom and the mantra, a prisoner in a freezing metal box with a chorus of the damned for company. A new sound cut through the cacophony, a sound so sharp and definitive, it shattered the hypnotic rhythm of the whispers. It was a hard, wet thump against the small, grime-caked window, set high on the shed's wall. Jack's head snapped up, his heart seizing in his chest. For a moment, there was nothing, just the swirling white chaos beyond the glass. Then it came again, harder this time. A violent, deliberate impact that rattled the entire pane in its frame. A face filled the window. It was pale, unnaturally so. The color of old bone bleached by centuries of ice. Its shape was all wrong, elongated and tapering to a narrow chin, with high, sharp cheekbones that looked like they could cut glass. It had no nose, just two slitted holes, and its mouth was a lipless, horizontal gash. But it was the eyes that froze the scream in Jack's throat. They were vast pools of absolute lightless black that consumed the upper half of its face. There was no white, no iris, no spark of consciousness or emotion, only a void, a perfect, starless night that seemed to suck the very light from the room. A raw, animal sound tore from Jack's lips, a scream of pure, undiluted terror. He scrambled backward, his boots slipping on the concrete, his hands flailing for a weapon. They closed around a length of cold, heavy iron pipe leaning against the workbench. He hefted it, his knuckles white, his entire body trembling as he stared at the thing outside. The creature pressed its face closer, the pale flesh of its cheek flattening against the glass. One of its hands rose into view, long, slender fingers ending in talons that were not claws, but sharp, translucent shards of ice. It began to scrape them down the window pane. The sound was not a scratch, but a deep, resonant screech, like a glacier calving, a noise that vibrated through Jack's teeth and set his nerves on fire. He stood his ground, pipe raised, a pathetic stance of defiance against this nightmare from the deep ice. The creature's black eyes remained locked on his, its scraping methodical, relentless. It seemed to be testing the barrier, studying his reaction. Then, as suddenly as it had appeared, it pulled back. Its elongated form melted away from the window, swallowed by the blinding swirl of the blizzard, as if it had never been. Jack stood panting, the pipe still held high, his muscles locked in a rictus of fear. He stared at the empty window, waiting for it to return. Slowly, he lowered his weapon and took a hesitant step forward. On the outside of the glass, where the creature's hands and face had been pressed, were 3 perfect frosty handprints, and the ghostly outline of its features. But the frost was not simply melting. It was sizzling, bubbling away from the glass with a faint hissing sound, vanishing into the air and leaving the pane clean and clear, as if seared by a cold more intense than any fire. The evidence of the encounter was erasing itself before his eyes, leaving him with nothing but the memory of that void-like stare and the chilling certainty that the things in the ice were no longer content to whisper. They were here. The decision was not born of courage, but of a final, desperate calculation. The shed was no longer a shelter. It was a coffin waiting to be pried open. The memory of those sizzling, self-erasing handprints on the glass was more terrifying than the blizzard itself. The storm had begun to subside, its fury spent, leaving behind a deceptive crystalline calm and a fresh, unbroken blanket of snow that glowed faintly under a shrouded moon. 5 miles. The relay station was 5 miles to the east, a haven of warmth, light, and a hardline communications rig that no static could silence. It was a distance that felt both impossibly far and his only conceivable chance. He would not wait for the thing with the black eyes to return with its kin. He would run. He took a deep, shuddering breath, his hand resting on the cold metal of the crate barricading the door. With a grunt of effort, he shoved it aside, the screech of metal on concrete, a profanity in the new quiet. He hesitated for only a second at the threshold, his eyes scanning the monochrome landscape. Nothing moved. The world was a still life of white and shadow. Then he burst from the shed, his boots sinking into the deep powder, and he ran. He did not get 10 yards before the shadows began to shift. They detached themselves from the deep gloom beneath the pipeline, tall, lean forms that moved with a fluid, silent grace that defied the physics of the deep snow. They did not run. They flowed, gliding between the support pylons, their pale bodies stark against the darkness. They made no sound. No crunch of snow, no rasp of breath. Their silence was a weapon more unnerving than any battle cry. Jack's heart hammered against his ribs, a frantic, painful drumbeat that seemed to fill the entire Arctic silence. He dared not look back for more than a fleeting second, each glance a snapshot of terror, a glint of moonlight on a limb with too many joints. The flash of a void-like eye, a pale shape keeping pace with him just at the edge of his vision. His survival instincts, honed by years in this wilderness, took over, shoving the paralyzing fear into a locked compartment of his mind. His world narrowed to the rhythm of his own ragged breath and the next pipeline marker. They were tall, numbered posts driven into the permafrost every quarter mile, his only guide through the featureless white. He fixed his eyes on the next one, the dark stitch in the endless fabric of snow, and pushed his burning legs toward it. Reach it, then the next, then the next. It was a mantra, a prayer. The pipeline itself was a constant, humming presence to his left, a steel god he had once served and now begged for protection. Every gasp of air was a knife in his lungs, every pounding footfall a tremor of exhaustion. But the terror at his back was a relentless whip, driving him forward, a lone spark of humanity fleeing the encroaching tide of the ancient cold. The chase was a blur of burning lungs, pounding heart, and the silent, flowing shadows that haunted his every step. Jack's flight had carried him beyond the familiar territory of the pipeline supports, into a wider wind-scoured basin he had only seen on maps. His legs heavy with exhaustion and fear, finally buckled, sending him stumbling forward into a deep drift. He lay there for a moment, chest heaving, the cold snow a shocking contrast to the fire in his muscles. Pushing himself up, he wiped the ice from his eyes, and the sight that greeted him stole the last vestiges of his strength. He had stumbled into a vast, circular clearing, a massive amphitheater carved from the ice itself, and at its center the earth had torn open. This was not like the jagged crack at Sector 7. This was a yawning, primordial wound, a split in the world that revealed a deep, blue-glowing interior. The low, resonant hum he had felt days ago was now a palpable vibration in the air, a deep thrum that shook the very ground and made his teeth ache. He was at the source, his eyes wide with a horror that transcended understanding, scanned the scene. Dozens of them were there. The pale, elongated beings were emerging from the glowing fissure with a slow, deliberate grace, moving as if shaking off the stiffness of a sleep that had lasted millennia. They climbed from the depths with their unnerving, multi-jointed limbs, their movements synchronized and silent. They stood or crouched on the ice, their smooth alabaster skin and void black eyes absorbing the weak moonlight, a pale army awakening from a frozen dream. This was not a handful of creatures. This was a colony, a population, stirring back to life. His gaze swept across the gathering, his mind reeling from the scale of it, when a flicker of familiar color snagged his attention. One of the beings, taller than the others, stood near the rim of the chasm. In one of its long, taloned hands, it clutched a scrap of fabric dark blue nylon, torn and frayed. Woven into the collar was a familiar red and black checkered pattern. It was Mike's jacket, the one his wife had given him last Christmas, the one he'd joked made him look like a lumberjack. The reality of it hit Jack with the force of a physical blow, a sucker punch to his soul that drove the air from his lungs. Mike wasn't just taken. He was a trophy, a piece of evidence in this terrifying reclamation. The final, horrorizing piece of the puzzle clicked into place. These beings were not invaders from some distant star. They were natives. They were the Iluanic of the old stories, the ancient consciousnesses of the ice, trapped and preserved in a glacial slumber for centuries, perhaps millennia. The pipeline with its constant, thrumming flow of warm oil, the seismic thumps of heavy machinery, the very vibration of modern man, it had been a persistent, aggravating alarm clock, disturbing their frozen hibernation. They were not emerging to conquer, but simply to wake up, to reclaim the world that had once been theirs. And he, Jack, was a witness to the end of one age and the terrifying dawn of another. He was not facing monsters. He was standing at the resurrection of a frozen god, and it held the tattered remains of his friend in its hand. The silence in the glacial amphitheater was a living entity, thick and heavy, broken only by the low, resonant hum that seemed to emanate from the core of the earth itself. The pale figures did not advance with menace, but with a slow, inexorable certainty, as if his presence was an anomaly they were methodically correcting. They flowed from the shadows of the ice walls, and the glowing chasm. Their movements a fluid, silent ballet that tightened the circle around him. Their black, depthless eyes were fixed on him, not with hatred, but with a cold, alien curiosity that was somehow more terrifying. He was a speck of warmth in their world of absolute cold, a flicker of life in their domain of ancient slumber, and they were moving to extinguish the irritation. Jack's breath hitched, his mind screaming, his body frozen between the primal urge to flee and the crushing knowledge that there was nowhere left to run. The image of Mike's torn jacket, clutched in that taloned hand, flashed behind his eyes, a spark of grief and rage in the sea of his terror. His hand, moving on, an instinct born of sheer desperation, plunged into the deep pocket of his parka. His fingers closed around the cold, familiar shape of the flare gun. It was a tool for signaling, for marking locations in a whiteout, a last-ditch cry for help. Now it was the only weapon he had left. He did not aim. He simply raised the pistol and pulled the trigger. The report was a deafening, violent crack that shattered the sacred silence of the clearing. A blazing, crimson comet erupted from the barrel, streaking on a low, horizontal trajectory across the open space. It slammed into the chest of the nearest creature and detonated in a shower of incandescent white-hot magnesium. The effect was instantaneous and profound. The creature did not scream. It made no sound at all, but its body recoiled with a violent, spasmodic jerk, as if it had been touched by something fundamentally profane. The others in the circle flinched back in unison, a wave of silent revulsion passing through them. Their smooth, pale skin seemed to repulse the intense heat and light. They shrank from the sizzling, sputtering flare on the ground, their void-like eyes seeming to flinch away from the unnatural brilliance. The heat was an agony to them, the light a violation of their lightless world. For a few precious seconds, the closing circle broke, their fluid grace replaced by a startled, alien aversion. Those seconds were all Jack had. He didn't think, he moved. With a raw, guttural shout, he charged forward, not away from the chasm, but toward the massive elevated pipeline itself. His eyes were locked on a large, wheel-shaped valve assembly, 20 yards away. A nexus of steel and industrial might bolted directly to the pipeline's flank. It was a part of the infrastructure he had serviced 100 times, a mundane piece of machinery. Now, it was his only conceivable advantage, a testament to the world of heat and pressure and man-made power that these ice-born things abhorred. He fought his way through the disrupted circle, his shoulder brushing against a creature that felt like solid, freezing marble, a shock of cold so intense it burned. He did not look back. His entire being focused on that valve, on the desperate, half-formed plan coalescing in his mind. He would use their own awakening against them. He would turn the artery of the modern world into a weapon. The cold, unyielding steel of the pipeline's support beam pressed into Jack's back, a final solid reminder of the world he was about to lose. His desperate sprint had ended here, cornered. The momentary disruption caused by the flare had vanished, and the circle of pale figures closed in once more, their silent, fluid advance more terrifying than any charge. Their black eyes were fixed upon him, voids of patient, ancient intent. The air grew colder still, a deep penetrating chill that sapped the warmth from his very soul. He was out of flares, out of tricks, a trapped animal facing an executioner. With no face, his gloved hands fumbled at his belt, his movements frantic, his breath pluming in rapid, panicked bursts. He unsnapped the small metal canister from his survival kit, the emergency diesel fuel, meant for priming a stubborn stove, or signaling in the most dire circumstances. His mind racing through a catalogue of useless options, seized upon a single primitive truth. With a final desperate prayer to a god he hadn't spoken to since childhood, he unscrewed the cap and sloshed the pungent, oily liquid in a wide arc across the snow at his feet. The smell of raw hydrocarbons filled the air, a stark, industrial scent in this primeval place. His numb fingers found the matchbook again. One last match. He struck it against the rough strip, the tiny flame flaring to life, a fragile, dancing defiance in the overwhelming gloom. He looked at the circle of advancing figures, at their expressionless faces and lightless eyes, and dropped the match. A soft whump sounded as the diesel ignited, and a low wall of fire, orange and blue, leapt up from the snow, creating a flickering, half-circle barrier between him and the creatures. The effect was immediate and profound. The advancing line halted as one. They did not cry out or recoil in panic, but their fluid grace stuttered into a collective, silent hesitation. They leaned back from the heat, their elongated forms swaying like pale reeds in a thermal wind. A sound emerged from them then, not a scream, but a unified, sibilant hiss, like a glacier cracking under immense pressure. It was a sound of pure aversion, the protest of absolute cold confronted by the fundamental heresy of flame. Their black eyes, which had held only a void-like curiosity, now seemed to churn with a deep, abiding revulsion. Crouched behind his fiery, temporary shield, the acrid smoke stinging his eyes, Jack felt a moment of surreal disconnect. The primal desperate act of building a fire, mankind's oldest weapon against the dark, was holding back things that had been old when fire was new. And in that moment of extreme vulnerability, with the hissing of the ice creatures a chorus to the crackle of his dying hope, his lips moved without conscious thought. A whisper, so faint it was lost to the flames, escaped him. It was a fragment of a childhood prayer, learned at his mother's knee. Words he had not uttered in decades, words meant for comfort in the face of the unknown. They felt foreign on his tongue, a relic from a life of simple fears, now offered as a pathetic plea against a horror that predated all scripture. The prayer was not an answer, but an admission of his own terrifying smallness. As the diesel fire began to gutter, its fuel nearly spent, his mind, stripped of everything else, began to race, searching for one final, impossible move in the frozen heart of the ice. The diesel fire died with a final sputtering hiss, its ephemeral warmth surrendering to the ancient, pervasive cold. The wall of flame that had held the creatures at bay collapsed into a smear of blackened, steaming snow, and the circle of pale figures which had recoiled from the heresy of the heat began to close once more. Their silent, fluid advance was relentless a tide of alabaster and shadow. Jack's moment of prayerful respite shattered. There was no more time for desperation, only for motion. He pushed off from the support beam, his body screaming in protest, and ran. He did not run blindly. He followed the steel spine of the pipeline, its familiar humming presence, his only guide through the nightmare. The creatures flowed after him, their movements silent and unnervingly swift, gliding over the snow as if it were glass. He could feel their presence at his back, a pressure of cold intent. His hand dove into his parka pocket, his fingers closing around another flare. He didn't stop, didn't aim. He twisted as he ran, pointed the pistol behind him, and fired. The brilliant red comet streaked past the advancing forms, forcing them to ripple away from its searing light and heat. It bought him 10 more yards. Then 20. He became a desperate metronome, a flight and deterrence. Run, twist, fire. Run, twist, fire. Each flare was a precious second of life, a tiny sun he hurled into the face of the encroaching night. The landscape became a blur of white and shadow, his world reduced to the rhythmic crunch of his own boots, the deafening crack of the flare gun, and the fleeting crimson illumination of the horrors on his heels. His lungs were twin bellows of fire, his legs leaden weights. He was exhausting his body and his ammunition, a dwindling resource in a seemingly endless chase. Then he saw it, a low, square shape materialized in the gloom ahead, nestled in the lee of a large pipeline support. The relay station. Its windows were dark, its satellite dish caked with ice. No friendly light glowed from within, no generator hum greeted him. It was as dark and silent as a tomb. A fresh wave of despair threatened to overwhelm him, but he crushed it down. It was shelter. It was a door he could close. He fired his last flare in a wide, scattering arc, the final, defiant act of a man with nothing left to burn. As the creature shied from the brilliant death throes of the magnesium, he put on a final, agonizing burst of speed and stumbled toward the station's heavy metal door. He grabbed the frozen handle, yanking with all his remaining strength. It didn't budge, locked or frozen shut. A sob of frustration tore from his throat. He turned, slamming his shoulder against the metal once, twice, the impacts jarring his bones. On the third try, with a screech of protesting metal and splintering wood, the door burst inward. He fell into the darkness, scrambling backward and kicking the door shut with his boot. He fumbled for a latch, a bolt, anything. His hands found a heavy, manual crossbar. He slammed it home, the solid thunk echoing in the small, pitch-black space. He collapsed against the door, his chest heaving, his body trembling with a fatigue so profound it felt like death. For a long moment, he just sat there in the absolute blackness, listening. No sound of scraping talons, no impact against the door. Only the frantic hammering of his own heart and the ragged saw of his breath. His eyes adjusted slowly. Weak moonlight filtered through the icy windows, revealing the outlines of a small room. A desk, a chair, and on the desk, the blocky, reassuring shape of a military-grade radio set. Hope, sharp and painful, lanced through him. He crawled toward it, pulling himself into the chair. His numb fingers found the power switch. A single, small light glowed amber. It was working. It had power. He grabbed the handset, his voice a dry, broken rasp as he keyed the microphone. Mayday, Mayday, Mayday. This is Pipeline Patrol 1. Jack. Sector near 7. There are things in the ice. The words tumbled out, distorted and fragmented by his exhaustion and the poor signal. He repeated the coordinates, his message a chaotic, desperate SOS into the void, a plea from a man who had stared into the heart of an ancient cold. They're awake, they're out. The handset slipped from his fingers, clattering onto the desk. The effort of the broadcast, the final expenditure of his last reserves, had emptied him completely. The darkness at the edges of his vision swelled, consuming the faint light from the radio, the outlines of the room, everything. His head slumped forward onto the cold metal of the console, and a profound, absolute stillness took him. He did not dream. He simply fell into a void of his own, a collapse as deep and silent as the ice from which he had fled. The first sound to pierce the void of Jack's exhaustion was not a sound at all, but a vibration, a deep, rhythmic thrumming that grew from a faint tremor in the floor to a deafening roar that shook dust from the relay station's rafters. It was the sound of rotor blades, a mechanical heartbeat. That was the most beautiful noise he had ever heard. Ray dawn light filtered through the grimy windows, revealing the ghostly shapes of 2 search and rescue helicopters settling onto the snow like giant, mechanical dragonflies. Figures in bright orange suits spilled out, their movements efficient and human, a stark contrast to the silent, flowing horrors of the night. They found him slumped against the bolted door, barely conscious, his skin waxy and pale, his lips tinged with blue. His muttering was incoherent, a low, continuous stream of fragmented pleas and warnings. The ice, the demons in the ice, Mike. They took Mike, Black Eyes. The words were slurred, his tongue thick and clumsy, with cold and trauma. The rescuers worked with practiced speed, their faces professionally neutral, though their eyes occasionally flickered with pity or unease. They wrapped him in thick foil-lined blankets, their touch clinical and sure. One of them pressed a thermal gel pack against his chest, the sudden warmth, a shock that made him gasp. As they lifted him onto a stretcher, his head lolled, and through slitted eyes, he saw one of the men pause, staring at the deep, parallel gouges in the snow that led away from the station goes, that looked nothing like animal tracks. Inside the warm, vibrating belly of the helicopter, a medic shone a light into his eyes and checked his vitals. Hypothermia. Severe. Frostbite on his fingers and toes. Exposure. The diagnoses were clean, clinical. Boxes to be checked on a form. When Jack tried to speak again, his voice a raw croak about the things that moved without sound, and the face at the window. The medic nodded, his expression one of gentle, condescending understanding. "It's the cold, son," the man said, his voice calm and patronizing. "Plays tricks on the mind. Frostbite delirium. You've been through an ordeal. Just rest now." The official report filed later that day would succinctly note that patrolman Jack Rourke was found suffering from severe exposure and stress-induced hallucinations, likely brought on by the trauma of his partner's disappearance and the extreme environmental conditions. The evacuation was a blur of noise and motion, a transition from the primal silence of the ice to the sterile hum of a medical facility in Fairbanks. He was processed, treated, and debriefed by men in crisp uniforms who took notes and nodded sympathetically. They listened to his ravings about geometric patterns and ancient beings, with the detached patience of men hearing a tall tale. They assured him that Mike's disappearance was being treated as a tragic accident, a man lost to the Alaskan wilderness. A story as old as the frontier itself. His account of ice demons was quietly and systematically dismissed, filed away not as a testimony, but as a symptom. As they wheeled him into a clean white room, the final, crushing weight settled upon him. It was not the cold, nor the fear, nor even the grief for Mike. It was the haunting, isolating knowledge that he alone had seen the truth. And in the bright, rational light of day, his truth had been diagnosed as madness. He was the sole survivor of a war against an enemy no one else believed existed, evacuated from the front lines of a nightmare, only to be imprisoned in the quieter, more insidious hell of being disbelieved. The cold had followed him home. It was not the biting, external cold of the Alaskan pipeline, but an internal chill that had taken root in his marrow, a permanent winter in his soul. Anchorage was a city of sound and light, of honking cars and the warm glow of diner windows. But to Jack, it was all muffled, happening on the other side of a thick pane of frost-covered glass. His small apartment felt too large, the silence within it a different quality from the wilderness. Silence, this one was empty, where the other had been full of watching things. He tried to rebuild, to slot himself back into the grooves of his old life. But the man who had driven the snowcat was gone, replaced by a haunted shell who flinched at the clatter of ice cubes in his own glass. Sleep was not a refuge, but a battleground. The moment he closed his eyes, he was back in the endless white. He felt the vibration of the hum through the floor of the shed, saw the geometric patterns writhing behind his eyelids, and woke gasping. The image of that pale, elongated face with its void black eyes hovering in the darkness of his bedroom. The shadows in the corner of his room would shift, and for a heart-stopping second, he would see a tall, lean form detach itself from the gloom before his rational mind reasserted itself, leaving him sweating and trembling in a tangle of damp sheets. He took to leaving the bathroom light on, the mundane yellow glow a pathetic ward against the primordial dark that now lived inside him. The uniform hung in his closet, a dark blue ghost he could not bear to look at. The heavy wool and sturdy patches were a skin. He had shed an identity that now felt like a lie. It represented a world of order and routine, a world where pipeline ghosts were just a joke, and the greatest danger was a faulty sensor. One evening, driven by a quiet, desperate need for catharsis, he took it down. He carried the heavy fabric out to the oil drum he used for burning trash in his small, snow-dusted backyard. The night air was crisp, but the cold he felt was the deep, ancient cold of the crevasse. He didn't hesitate. He struck a match and dropped it onto the folded uniform. The flames took hold slowly, then surged, consuming the synthetic fibers with a hungry roar. Orange light danced on the snow, and for a moment he saw not a uniform burning, but a wall of diesel fire holding back a circle of silent advancing figures. He watched until the last patch was charred black, the embers glowing like malevolent eyes in the dark. As the fire died down, he made a vow to himself, a promise whispered into the smoky air. He would never speak of it again. He would lock the memory away in the deepest, coldest part of himself, where the things in the ice belong. No one would believe him, and trying to make them only carved the horror deeper into his own mind. He would carry the secret alone. But the vow could not erase the wondering, standing there in the aftermath of the small, symbolic fire. He looked past the city lights toward the vast, dark expanse of the wilderness. The pipeline was still out there, a steel serpent pumping warm lifeblood through the frozen veins of the land, and in the deep blue heart of the ice, in the silent, patient dark, he knew with a certainty that was his alone, that they were still out there, too. Awake, waiting. And the lingering cold in his bones was not a memory. It was a connection, a thread of frost, stretching all the way from his quiet backyard to the glowing chasm where the ancient world had cracked open and would never fully close